I grew up on the outskirts of Bacchus Marsh on the Lutadure Gorge. So I had this kind of, one side was this beautiful, pristine, untouched forest and gorge extending into the Wombat State Forest. And then the other side was an urban sprawl of chaos and housing developments. And so we were kind of right in the middle and got to experience, the changing landscape sort of firsthand. I guess the things you started to notice were animals would start to move into the bush or more sort of secluded spaces. But, roads came in and houses were being built, housing estates. So I guess it was this kind of playground to explore kind of natural bushland or this kind of housing estate that is kind of spreading across the land. So I guess, in some ways it's like this kind of creeping violence of the landscape. And being a young kid and being bored at times, you'd often result in activities that weren't looked at favourably. So we would vandalise a lot of these new places, these new houses, housing estates. We'd play in them, we'd explore them. And I guess, you would find things on the way, and that's kind of extended into understanding the changing landscape and my work practice now, which explores, there's a lot of different themes, but most of them have been around property development and the landscape, sort of the capitalisation of post-colonial land. So I guess that's where, a lot of that idea of collecting things relating to building and development, things relating to the landscape. But then within that also you find lots of rubbish, but also useful things in there as well.
Well, your work has always been really about materiality, hasn't it? It's it's everything from sticks, clay, through to building materials, and you just kind of recreate environments in different levels, don't you?
Reusing or recycling in some aspects, using materials around us. I guess a lot of them relate to a site and sort of being site specific. They might be, rubbish, building refuse, reusing that and repurposing it as a way to understand site-specific projects and how they're fraught with fitting into kind of capitalism in a sense.
Would you describe your practice as a sustainable art, environmentally sustainable art practice?
I do practice in my life to be more sustainable, but my art practice is more a reflection of the world itself, but also kind of a fuck you as well.
Would you describe your work as landscape art?
It does reflect the landscape, but it also reflects the trauma of the landscape, geotrauma, in a way that it's looking at something that had occurred there, but not necessarily just sticking with recent time, but kind of looking back into older histories of the landscape.
How would you define older landscape? Back to Indigenous ownership?
Yeah, definitely. I think, a lot of landscape art has always been about post-colonial gaze of the landscape, but the landscape is so much older, and just because it's not recorded in a Western kind of white context doesn't mean that it hasn't existed and that there were occurrences that happened. I mean, if we look at geology, there's so much that we can tell about our area and what's happened back in time. If we listen to Indigenous stories of the landscape, there's so much that we find that has happened that we don't know about. One of the problems with site-specific art is that it's very much focused on a post-colonial look in at something. It's a very recent landscape.
I'd like to talk a little bit about Monuments to Thieves, the recent work you put up at the Wagga Art Gallery. I mean, that does hint at least at the notion of colonial stealing of the landscape. But was that part of the motivation? Monument to Thieves could mean a lot of things. It could be a self-portrait.
What I was looking at there was when, looking across the landscape, especially in Melbourne, we just see a lot of high-rise apartments going up. And, a part of our landscape is just these huge structures in these residential areas, like monuments themselves, but they're all created by developers. They're everywhere. And I guess Monuments to Thieves was an exhibition about the changing landscape and these things appearing and an exploration of it. So the exhibition itself was kind of a way to explore the space, the gallery space, like you would explore a building site when no one was there.
In many ways, you've always come across as something of an outsider. You don't seem to fit into the kind of cliches of art gallery work and the rules that sort of seem to abide there. Who would you consider to be your peers, and how would you see yourself fitting in?
I think all the interesting things happen in peripheries. That goes through music, art, a lot of different areas. And I feel that in terms of people or groups I would look up to, there's so many. But for example, I really like Nicholas Mangan's work and the way that he looks at time and deep time and things that are kind of beyond the human. There's also Italian artist Roberto Cawoji, who looks at the kind of history of the human race and the practices that we've used as spiritual practices, and the way that the idea that things are forgotten, art that sort of transcends the present. Yeah, I'm sort of drawn to things that aren't really the present.
So, do you see yourself as having any kind of peer group in Melbourne?
There's a lot of artists and friends that I've worked with and respect. I really love when people do something different, and I've spent a lot of time doing sound work, and I find that the people doing work is different and exciting is kind of on the peripheries of whether that's genres or styles, or people that are isolated rather than being around and influenced by a group.
Music is a big part of your life, isn't it?
Yeah. I spent many years writing noisy electronic music, and it kind of came from like a dance background, as in rave music. But it was kind of more as a punk kind of movement against the kind of mainstream electronic music. So yeah, that's been a really big influence in how I make my visual art. But they're also merging as well, especially finding recently with lockdown in Melbourne here that these practices that I've been involved in haven't really joined, or they've been near one another, but they've never been combined. So I guess this idea of that sort of combining now, because I'm isolated, I'm in a smaller space, there's less social interaction, and so I tend to start drawing back on other experiences I've had. So, this idea of extreme electronic music, a lot of it was deliberate attempt to derail the norm or the mainstream. It was also a way to, we would put on shows deliberately to get kicked out of the show as being the performers and artists, because it wasn't house music. So it's this sort of idea of shocking or making people uncomfortable, because I sort of feel that these new areas or these peripheries are far more exciting, and people are hesitant to step into them, whether that's to experience it or play a part as a creative.
Well, whether it be music or your actual art making, there seems to be a consistent theme of physicality. The collecting of materials for the work, the actual way you put it on has the appearance, at least, of being quite exciting and very physical.
I like to shock, and I like big, rich things. So, for example, in terms of music and making music, that would be, involving things that were, in a sense, kind of thick, like big band jazz and classical music, but coming from a noise background, something that is very flamboyant and obvious, but it's also like you either hate it or you're intrigued by it.
Do you have any ideas as to what you might produce for a NotFair?
Yeah, I've got some ideas. I'm not going to give them away right now, but I'm definitely working on a way to merge these ideas that I'm looking at. But yeah, we'll have to wait and see. I'll let you know closer to it.
Well, whenever it is, but we're working on it.
Yeah.
Okay, mate, that should do us. Thank you very, very much.
Thanks for having us.
No, it's a pleasure.
All right.
I'm looking forward to this. Okay.
Take care. Talk soon.
See ya.